This week we're looking at the elements of graphic design. What are the elements of graphic design? Well, those are the parts that we use to put our design together. And the crazy thing about it is no one really agrees on what those elements are outside of a couple of items. There is no standardization across the field of graphic design for listing what the elements and principles of design are. One book lists line and shape and figure or ground. Figure or ground is simply the negative and positive space as part of the formal elements. And then they sort of digress off into talking about typographic shapes. We have another book that lists 7 different elements of design, which is the one we're going to actually use. And then there's another book that lists 6 items. The area that we work in, which is our space, and figure and ground are kind of agreed on. It's agreed that there's line, it's agreed that there is shape or form, but the rest of it kind of gets muddled. And how do we decide? This has been an ongoing problem within the graphic design community ever since graphic design, I think, has been around. It's a little bit fuzzy. The remaining areas that we have listed sometimes can be addressed as the principles of graphic design. But white space is not your enemy lists the list of 7, and that's actually more the tradition that I have learned, and so we're going to stick with that one. So the first element we're going to look at is line. So the smallest unit of a line is a point. A line is simply an elongated point. It's considered to be the path of a moving point. It has length and it can have width, but it doesn't have any depth to it. It can be a wide line or a thin line, but it's not going to have any depth as far as how far back into space it moves or how far forward. A solid line is a mark that's drawn across a surface. Line defines shapes. It creates objects. It creates images. It creates letters. It creates patterns. An implied line is a non-continuous line that the viewer perceives as being continuous. It's directional. It creates a line of movement. It's a basic element. It can define a shape. It creates edges. Edges are boundaries between shapes. Lines can define areas in a composition. When lines are the predominant element, the style is termed linear. Lines can be horizontal. They can be vertical. They can be diagonal. They can be thin. They can be thick. They can be straight, they can be curvy, they can be any combination, they can be solid, they can be dashed. Thick lines convey a feeling of strength. A diagonal line that changes from thick to thin creates the illusion of spatial perspective. This looks like a road going off into the distance with each lane getting smaller and the center line getting tinier. Lines define area. They divide space. They can suggest movement, or they can do just about anything else the artist really needs it to do. Lines can be used to convey meaning. These are normally learned responses that follow cultural norms. Horizontals are considered calm. Verticals are considered strong. Jagged lines can be stressful, or they can be energetic. Curved lines can be playful. A group of thin lines that encounter a bold vertical can suggest conflict or a struggle. Line delineates the limits of space. It creates what we call positive space. Illustrations sometimes are referred to as line art. Lines are expressive. They show movement. They direct the way your eye moves across the page. Shape has height and width. Sometimes we call shape form. That's actually incorrect. Form is really a three-dimensional item where shape is two-dimensional. Join two ends of a line together, you get a shape. Shape has height and it has width. Shapes are going to be organic or inorganic. Organic shapes look like the things that are found in nature. They're irregular, they're curvy. They're also referred to as curvilinear or sometimes biomorphic. Inorganic shapes are geometric. They have sharp corners, perfect arcs, rectangles, circles, polygons. Those are also referred to as rectilinear or sometimes rigid shapes. Irregular shapes are a combination of both straight and curved lines. Accidental shapes are those that are actually caused by accident, like spilling ink, or maybe a process like making blottings. Non-objective or non-representational shapes are invented and they don't represent anything. Representational shapes are recognizable and they'll remind somebody about an object. Abstract shapes are altered or distorted and they're rearrangements of the natural appearance of something and they're very stylized. Shapes can trigger instant recognition. A seashell. How about a stop sign? Shapes can be evocative. An apple silhouette might be a referent for the first day of school, or maybe it refers to a fresh fall day. In graphic design, our space for print or web or motion is usually rectangular. Text blocks are typically rectangular. Not always, but they're still referred to as copy blocks. Shapes can be linear, or they can have soft edges. They can have implied or actual lines, or they can be created by color or even by texture. These add meaning to what our layout is. Patterns and textures are one of the elements that will get grouped sometimes into the principles of design. They'll put them in as part of rhythm, so we do have some overlapping. But patterns are created by repeating an element. I think most of us are familiar with plaids. Plaid is a repetition of lines of color. They're repeated in a set order. Checkerboard is simply a repeating block of color. The total effect is going to be more than the individual parts. Repetition of line or shape can bring energy and motion into a composition. Patterns can also be used to create texture. Texture is a tactile quality. It can be very real, like the surface of a brick or the bark of a tree. It can be perceived, like polished granite. You can see all the grains in there, but it's very smooth to the touch. That perceived texture can cause an emotion or some type of sensation in the viewer. If you're working in sculpture or in textiles or mixed media, you will have real texture. Books might have leather or even cloth covers. The text might be embossed on them. Books for toddlers often have textiles that are glued inside of them to touch. We don't get to use the texture in print other than our selection of paper or what other type of media we're printing on. Paper can be smooth or it can be rough. But, a computer screen is just slick and smooth. So designers mimic the idea of texture using lines and shapes and patterns to create a 2D visual version of something that's actually three-dimensional. Space is the next element we're going to talk about. Think of your text and your visuals as kids, and the space that you're working in is the sandbox that they're playing in. You want them to play well together. Space isn't a vacuum. Space isn't invisible. Space is the area where you arrange the type and the visuals. The stuff that we have inside, these shapes and the shapes that are formed by the text blocks, that's our figure or positive space. The space that doesn't have something in it is the negative space. You might hear it called ground and background. So the empty space is the background or ground. The stuff that has things in it is the positive space. Just because an area doesn't have something solid in it doesn't mean that it isn't important. White space or negative space has weight and it has structure. And that's the other thing, is not all white space is white. In graphic design, there's a saying, white space is nice, because it gives your eye a place to rest. It can indicate a change and it helps to organize. Amateurs try to cram every single part of a design full of stuff. No white space, just a lot of positive stuff. This design has no white space. There's no place for the eye to rest. You can't process all of the information that's presented here. Sometimes negative space and positive space are negotiable, like in these optical illusions. Which is the foreground? What's the background? Which is figure? Which is ground? What's your white space? Do you see the urn or do you see the two faces? How about in this one? Do you see the woman's leg or the man's leg? What about something abstract like this? What part is ground? What part is figure? White space creates contrast. It creates tension. It improves legibility. It allows your mind to process the information or the ideas that are presented. It lets your design breathe. Negative space exists within letter forms. This capital letter G that has a counter shape inside, we don't really notice it. It is there. It affects how we perceive the letter. It tells us whether this is a bold letter, maybe is it a graceful letter, maybe it's something that's forceful. White space exists between the lines of text. It exists between each word. White space affects the weight of a paragraph. It affects the weight of the text as a whole. It helps to contrast the margins. Consider white space not just in print but also on web design. Space around navigational elements, around information, around the images. That all allows the viewer to figure out how to navigate, what they're supposed to read next, and where to go from there. Sites that are too busy without white space don't allow the eye to rest. Motion design on web or video uses white space. It provides a pause, a bit of a quiet. Visitors need the time to digest what they just saw. Consider how busy something like this is. You can't process this. Size and scale is another element. We accept some perception of scale just as a general convention. Items that are bigger are usually considered to be closer to us. We accept this as part of perspective. Items that are bigger can carry more weight. They can demand more attention, and usually are considered to be more important. Varying the size of shapes in a design helps to create the illusion of depth. It also creates some order. If a bigger item is more important, it says, "Look at me first." Value is tones of light and dark. Between white and black, we have varying shades of gray. This is what we would refer to as grayscale. The wider the variety of gray values, from very light to very dark, the more depth and dimension we perceive. Images with very limited gray values will appear to be flat. Remember that color has value in terms of light and dark. If you desaturate or convert to grayscale, you'll see the values of those images. Color is so important that we're going to cover it separately. For now, know that color is divided into 3 categories. We have hue, value, and saturation. Hue being the name of the color, value as to whether it is a light or dark, and saturation, which is how pure that color is.